So the name of my presentation is Try This Operating System. A few of my work colleagues are here and they know that I'm not talking about a computer operating system because I have very little to say on subjects like that. I'm talking about one of nature's operating systems that we all have, and that is our senses and how they help us access the world. So I'll take you back to like kindergarten or first grade when you probably saw something like this in a classroom. You learned we have 5 senses. And everybody has these senses, and they're sort of your gateway to the world. They're how we access other people and nature. When you think about it, without any senses, we are just sort of freestanding units without connections. But what if something goes wrong? So maybe you haven't really thought much more about your senses since that time, because like any good operating system, if it's working well, it's invisible. It's in the background, you never think about it. If something goes wrong, you might start thinking about it. What if you had senses that worked well? All 5 of your senses, mechanics are good, the hardware is right. You go to any doctor and they tell you this is fine, you have functioning senses. But they're not synchronized with one another across time properly. What if you have limited ability to regulate your senses, to regulate the intensity of your experience of the senses? Meet Elizabeth Grace Mayer. She is 13 years old, she's my daughter, and she's a lovely kid. She happens to have autism. I have many reasons to believe that Elizabeth has some of those sensory problems I just mentioned a minute ago. So I'm going to talk about Elizabeth, I'm going to talk about her senses. I'm not going to talk about everyone with autism, I'm not going to talk about everything that has to do with autism. This is a pretty narrow comment. So first, sight. Her visual memory is actually extraordinary. If you play the memory game against her, you should prepare to be crushed. That's what you're seeing in this picture. She's administering a beat down to me playing the memory game. Because once she sees something, she never loses where she saw it and what it was. She's also great at puzzles. This puzzle of a tiger reminds me of when she was a little tiny kid and she solved a tiger puzzle. And I said to her, "What's in there?" And she said, "It's a puzzle." And I said, "No, what's in there?" pointing to the picture. And she said, "Pieces." That makes me think that her vision maybe focuses more on the component pieces than it does on the whole. I've seen her solve a puzzle with the image face down on the floor, just looking at the shapes and matching up those pieces of cardboard. Oh, we're already with sound. Hearing. Funny how that happens. She likes music. She loves music. She loves Taylor Swift. She loves that album of Taylor Swift. If anybody needs to know anything about any song on that album, I'm your source for that. She could listen to it all day long. She seems very comforted by the repetition of music. That said, when you hear from high-functioning people on the spectrum, they will tell you they have very limited ability to regulate the intensity of different sounds. So the sound of the speaker's voice might be as loud as the sound of the heater that's humming, might be as loud as the sound of a car going by, it might be as loud as the humming fluorescent lights. They also will tell you that the audio and visual don't always sync, so hence the picture of Godzilla, circa 1964. I think this happens for Elizabeth because when she's listening really intently, she does not want to look at the person who's speaking. And I think it's because it's very disorienting for her when the mouth does not match up with the sound. Sense of smell, she is a champion sniffer. It's a little bit like having an animal for a child sometimes, because I'll see her and she'll run up and just give me a huge, like a big whiff. I think it's an uncomplicated way for her to experience the world, and she sort of marks people by scent. It's also possible that I just smell really good. Sense of taste. If I could get sort of an off-brand food past her sense of smell, which is a big if, I think she would immediately detect that it's not her thing and she would reject it. She has a very fine sense of taste, and she eats like 8 things. But I think this is one of her ways, it's not uncommon with people on the spectrum, to have limited tastes, and I think it's one way where she can say, I'm going to limit some of my sensory input on this one. Sense of touch. So I believe that Elizabeth does not always or often know where she is in space. That's why she loves water so much. It's like a giant "you are here" sign. It exerts pressure on her from all directions, and she really could stay in there, pretty much always. That's not Elizabeth, nor is it my dog, but that is kind of a thing. A lot of people with autism have service dogs that are trained to lie on top of them. Again, giving them the sensory input of, you are here, this is your space. That's a chair. More specifically, it's a broken chair, and there's another one behind it that's also a broken chair. Those are in my dining room. Elizabeth does not have a great sense of like the force with which she moves through space. So she breaks my chairs like all the time. My dad keeps fixing them, she keeps breaking them. She's not doing it intentionally. She might touch a cat with the same force that someone else would open a jar, and it's just a regulation thing. So is this child doomed to a life of misery? She is not, though she is in a hammock swing, which is one of her favorite places because, again, gravity kind of tells her where she is in space. She's a happy kid, and there's much that's good about her life. Is she going to have deep philosophical discussions with me about the meaning of life anytime soon? Probably not. And I think it's because the vast amount of her energy is exerted on processing this crazy amount of sensory information that's coming at her at all times. Is parenting a very steep curve with a kid like Elizabeth? It most certainly is. I realized from Elizabeth that I come at parenting her, as I do with my other two kids, with a whole lot of assumptions that their experience of the world is like my experience of the world. So she has shown me, A, I am making an assumption, and B, it's incorrect. And lastly, can everyone in this room view the world with slightly different eyes as this group, my family, has? Understanding that A, you have an operating system, and B, others around you may have a very different one. I sure hope so.